Hello, 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 and welcome to the bonus episode of today's FYI on propaganda. And something I forgot to mention in the first part, it's not propaganda. It's not an O in English, it's propaganda. Well, just bear it in mind. If you're saying it in Spanish, it's propaganda. If you're saying it in English, it's propaganda. Hey, I know what you're thinking. It's just a little nuance, but it's those nuances that make the difference. Just look at a Monet painting. Those little details, those little strokes are what made the difference. So before we get started, is propaganda a bad thing? I mean, we've looked at it in different areas. We looked at it with the church, where its name came from. And I guess if you're spreading a message of love and caring, as the church says they do, well, is that a bad thing? Is that a bad message to propagate? To spread? I don't know. You have to make that judgment. But either way, I think not giving people all the information and just giving them one side of the story or leaving out facts, well, it makes it really hard to make an informed decision. So I would prefer to get all the facts. Sadly, we don't. And we are often manipulated by companies, by politicians, by church figures, even celebrities. Anybody we put on a pedestal. So I guess the answer is it depends on what side of the propaganda you're on. If you're the one being brainwashed or manipulated, well, nobody wants to be brainwashed or manipulated. But if you're the one doing the brainwashing and manipulating, well, then it's a great thing for you. Look at Edward Bernays. He made millions and made a name for himself. And I know what you're thinking. I keep talking about Edward Bernays. We're getting to him, trust me. But there was a literary debate between him and a guy named Everett Dean Martin. And Everett Dean Martin argued that, and I quote, "Propaganda is making puppets of us. We are moved by hidden strings, which the propagandist manipulates." So according to Everett Dean Martin, it's a bad thing. In the 1920s and 30s, propaganda was sometimes described as an all-powerful entity. Bernays wrote a book called, you guessed it, Propaganda. And in that book, he defends the other side. He's saying propaganda's necessary. This is what he says. "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of." I don't know if it's positive or negative, but it is powerful. You can start wars with propaganda. And let's take a look at some propaganda in history. There was tons of propaganda in the Vietnam War. When I was growing up, I remember the Cold War. And in school, I remember us always saying, the Russians are the bad guys. The Russians are going to try and come here and take away our freedom. And it was everywhere, even in the movies. And we're going to talk about movies, but just think of Rocky IV. Who was the bad guy in Rocky IV? The Russian. That was right at the height of the Cold War. That was not an accident. And in World War II, the Nazis, they were the kings of propaganda. But as we saw, it's something that's been around since the dawn of civilization. And we're going to talk about Goebbels right now, the guy who really ran the Nazi propaganda machine. But first, I wanted to send a special shout out to those posters that everybody loves, but are propaganda nonetheless. The "I Want You" poster with Uncle Sam. That was part of a propaganda campaign to recruit young people to the army. And what about Rosie the Riveter? She's that famous poster of that woman making a muscle. And that was a campaign during World War II, which encouraged the women to get into factories and help the war effort on the home front. And I forgot to mention The Art of War, the famous book. It has elements of propaganda in it as well. Elements such as psychological warfare. The fact that you don't only have to beat the soldiers with guns and out there on the field, but you've got to beat them up mentally, psychologically, wear them down. And then there have been not-so-fun experiments on humankind, such as MK Ultra, which was a mind control program established by intelligence in the United States. We could do a whole episode on MK Ultra. It's not just a Muse song. But we're going to go back to Goebbels right now, because Goebbels is perhaps one of the most infamous propagandists ever, and he was also very effective. But what was his secret? His secret was he learned from the best, or the worst, however you look at it. He learned from Sigmund Freud's nephew. And who is Sigmund Freud's nephew? Edward Bernays. We've been talking about him the whole episode without talking about him. The father of PR, public relations. The guy who lived to be 103 years old. The guy who wrote the book on propaganda. And I mean that literally. His book is called Propaganda. Well, one of his many books. And hey, patrons, I'm going to share the audiobook with you on Patreon. But obviously, he was no stranger to psychology. I mean, his uncle was Sigmund Freud, although they differed on many things. But he knew the power of psychology, the power of suggestion, and how the mind in the right conditions could be easily manipulated. He turned it into a science, and the Nazis took note. One famous story of the Nazis is how they practically gave away radios. They gave them away or sold them dirt cheap on one condition, that you would put it in the window and you would turn the volume up all the way. They didn't have internet back then, so that was how they spread their message. And did it work? Sadly, yes. The world was taken over by a madman who had managed to brainwash a whole nation. And they learned it all from Edward Bernays. In the United States, we have an expression, I don't know if you say it in Spanish, but we say, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. You want to know something? That's BS. It's not more important than any other meals. Yeah, sure, you should eat different things for dinner than you eat for breakfast, but it doesn't make it more important. Well, Bernays not only made this up, but he made it something that Americans say over and over and over. I think I've heard people say that expression 1,000,000 times. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Is it? Well, he convinced the whole nation it was. And he also convinced them that bacon was part of a healthy breakfast, because at that time, Americans were having light breakfasts. But he was hired by a bacon company, and they needed to sell more bacon. So he said, I'm going to make bacon synonymous with breakfast. And he did it. In the United States, bacon and eggs is still synonymous with breakfast. Let's hear from the master himself, Edward Bernays.
Many years ago, our client was the Beachy Net Packing Company. We made a research and found out that the American public ate very light breakfasts of coffee, maybe a roll, and orange juice. We went to our physician, found that a heavy breakfast was sounder from the standpoint of health than a light breakfast, because the body loses energy during the night and needs it during the day. We asked the physician, after telling him why we were talking to him, would he be willing, at no cost, to write to 5,000 physicians and ask them whether their judgment was the same as his, confirmed his judgment. He said he would be glad to do it. We carried out a letter to 5,000 physicians. Obviously, all of them concurred that a heavy breakfast was better for the health of the American people than a light breakfast. That was publicized in the newspapers newspapers throughout the country had headlines saying 4,500 physicians urge heavy breakfast in order to improve health of American people. Many of them stated that bacon and eggs should be embodied with the breakfast, and as a result, the sale of bacon went up. And I still have a letter from Bartlett Arkell, president of Beechnut Packing Company, telling me so.
Quite interesting. And he was still doing interviews into his old age. You can find a lot of them over on YouTube. And everybody started to take note, especially the U.S. government. They said, wait, this guy's pretty powerful. And there was something that was called the Committee on Public Information. It was started by the government during World War I, and it existed from 1917 to 1919. And Bernays was on the board. And this agency was created to influence public opinion to support the U.S. in World War I, and also, obviously, on the home front. And in the 26 months that the CPI was in service, they used every medium available to create enthusiasm for the war effort. And this is a very notable example of propaganda in the United States. So we're seeing the use for commercial purposes, we're seeing in wartime, but also they realized that it was something that could be used during peacetime as well. And that politicians, if they had somebody helping them out, a consultant who knew a little bit about propaganda and public relations, well, then they could win any campaign. And eventually he was hired by President Calvin Coolidge. And you heard what I said, president. He won. Another extremely controversial thing that Edward Bernays did was with the bananas in Guatemala. And basically, there was an American banana company there. Now it's called the Chiquita Banana Company. And the leader at the time said something like, you guys are out of here, or you have to pay more money. He said something that this company didn't like, and it was going to infringe on their business. It was going to take away from their bottom line, from their profits. So they decided to use propaganda to stage and organize a coup d'etat. This was in 1954, and they overthrew the government. And at first, they said it was communist, it was this, that, the other, again, the name calling. But really, it was because it was a conflict of interest for their business. And so they got really organized and created a campaign. And in 1954, they overthrew the government there. And to this day, the Chiquita Banana Company is making money hand over fist. So we can even overthrow governments with propaganda. Another interesting example with Edward Bernays is when he got women to smoke. He made it fashionable for women to smoke. He even went as far as calling cigarettes torches of freedom. Because if you put everything into context, during that time there was suffrage. Women were fighting for the right to vote. And the idea behind the campaign was, don't let any man hold you down. You can smoke just like a man. Light up those freedom torches. And what he did was he got some very attractive women. Now they would be called influencers. Back then they were called trendsetters. And he had them light up during the Easter parade in New York City. No, not in Kansas. No, not in West Virginia. In New York City, where the world was watching. There was press there. And before you knew it, people worldwide saw these women lighting up on TV in a parade. And it was liberating. Or at least they were made to feel that way. I'm smoking as an act of rebellion. Because I can. Because you can't stop me. I've got a little audio clip that further explains it. Let's give it a listen.
When whippoorwill call. This episode is about Freud's American nephew, Edward Bernays. Bernays is almost completely unknown today, but his influence on the 20th century was nearly as great as his uncle's. Because Bernays was the first person to take Freud's ideas about human beings and used them to manipulate the masses. He showed American corporations for the first time how they could make people want things they didn't need by linking mass-produced goods to their unconscious desires. Out of this would come a new political idea of how to control the masses. By satisfying people's inner selfish desires, one made them happy and thus docile. It was the start of the all-consuming self, which has come to dominate our world today. Bernays set out to experiment with the minds of the popular classes. His most dramatic experiment was to persuade women to smoke. At that time, there was a taboo against women smoking, and one of his early clients, George Hill, the president of the American Tobacco Corporation, asked Bernays to find a way of breaking it. A. Brill was one of the first psychoanalysts in America, and for a large fee, he told Bernays that cigarettes were a symbol of the penis and of male sexual power. He told Bernays that if he could find a way to connect cigarettes with the idea of challenging male power, then women would smoke, because then they would have their own penises. Every year, New York held an Easter Day parade to which thousands came, and Bernays decided to stage an event there. He persuaded a group of rich debutantes to hide cigarettes under their clothes. Then they should join the parade, and at a given signal from him, they were to light up the cigarettes dramatically. Bernays then informed the press that he had heard that a group of suffragettes were preparing to protest by lighting up what they called torches of freedom.
A symbol, women, young women, debutantes, smoking a cigarette in public with a phrase that means anybody who believes in this kind of equality pretty much has to support them in the ensuing debate about this, because torches of freedom.
Every metaphor and analogy has to come from somewhere. Perhaps they are rare pearls that dropped from the pens of an elite corps of bards and scribblers and then are hoarded by a grateful populace. But given their prevalence in language, it seems more likely that they are the natural products of the way everyone's mind works.
And so the next day, this was not just in all of the New York papers, it was across the United States and around the world. And from that point forward, the sale of cigarettes to women began to rise. He had made them socially acceptable.
That's fascinating. And there are full documentaries just on that story. But another thing Bernays believed in was creating a want or a need for that product. And he did that by targeting on people's desires, playing on their feelings, using the right words and the right music and the right symbols. Just think of how the right song can make us cry. Or if you watch a trailer in a movie, it's usually exciting. There's a reason for it, because it makes us feel a certain way. And this was turned into a science by Edward Bernays. Let's take a look at some of it in pop culture. We've all heard Orwellian. Well, George Orwell, his novel 1984. And this was about a dystopian, totalitarian future. Some say the surveillance we're experiencing today is very Orwellian. There's also a movie called Wag the Dog. I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. Well, first, the expression to wag the dog means to distract attention away from a political scandal, usually through military action. So it's saying, hey, don't look at what just happened. Look over here. The movie is awesome. It stars Dustin Hoffman and Robert De Niro. What a cast and what a movie. It's called Wag the Dog. It's a perfect example of how spinning a story and how manipulation and propaganda are used. We already mentioned the Russian in Rocky IV, but I remember every movie in the 80s, the Russians were the bad guys. And that was not an accident. They needed to instill that in our minds. Russia bad. Well, unless you were watching a Spielberg movie, in that case, all the bad guys were the Nazis. Some movies that are famous, or shall I say infamous for propaganda, are Triumph of the Will. This movie was literally an ad for the Third Reich. It made Hitler look like a golden boy, a leader of leaders, Another very controversial one is Birth of a Nation. It came out in the United States in 1915. And even though it was groundbreaking, the cinematography, it used some angles that had never been used before. It had many racist themes, and it portrayed African American slaves as violent heathens, animals. And the KKK, well, they were heroes. They would ride in on their horses to save the day. And it's a movie that continues to polarize viewers. But some say that the KKK grew in size because of this movie, tremendously. Another one which pokes fun at the subject is The Great Dictator, obviously with the one and only Charlie Chaplin, and that was from 1940. Speaking of, if you haven't listened to the episode on dictators yet, give it a listen. All right, now we're going to play a game just to show you how powerful some slogans can be and how they stick with us forever. I'm going to tell you the slogan, and you tell me the brand. The first one's really easy. Da-da-da-da-da. See, I didn't even say the slogan. I just gave you the music. I'm loving it. I'm loving it. Did you say McDonald's? Great job. But somebody should teach McDonald's a little grammar. You can't use non-action verbs in the gerund. I'm knowing her. I'm loving it. And so on and so forth. But they used poetic license, and it worked. What about this one? I'll sing this one to you. The best a man can get. Did you say Gillette? You got it. All right, here's another one. It melts in your mouth, not in your hand. Did you say M&M's? You got it. Here's another one. Impossible is nothing. Adidas. Nice job. All right, let's see if you know this one. I think this one's really American. Snap, crackle, pop. Did you say Rice Krispies? Well, the three characters were called Snap, Crackle, Pop, and supposedly those are the noises it makes in your mouth. All right, this next one is really easy. Just do it. You got it. Nike, or Nike, as you say. A good slogan is timeless, it seems. Let's take a look at some idioms and expressions. We already looked at the word misleading. When something is misleading, it lies to you, but it's because it doesn't tell you the whole truth. It reminds me of the word to lead somebody on, to make somebody believe something that isn't. Are you leading me on? Are you misleading me? Remember, we're always playing with words, and you conjugate it the same way as the word lead. He misled me. Lead, led, led. Mislead, misled, misled. We also mentioned the word mindset before, your attitude. We talked a lot about the mind on today's shows. It reminds me of the expression mind over matter. Mind over matter means you can convince your mind of anything in the right circumstances, even if something is tangible and right in front of you. And I guess that's where the power of propaganda comes from. People exploiting that. We already talked about the word spin before. We said you can spin a story or to put a spin on it, and that means to put your own opinion into it, your own take. Another expression that has to do with lying is to pull the wool over someone's eyes, to try not to let them see the truth. It's a little different from fibbing or kidding. These are little lies kids tell. Are you fibbing? I use that one with my daughter a lot. Then we've got white lies. I think you say mentira piadosa. It's just a little lie. It's similar to bending the truth. Did you just lie to me? Well, no, I was bending the truth. That means I wasn't exactly telling you everything. A little bit different than lying through your teeth. That's something a compulsive liar does. We looked at the word BS before. If you don't believe something somebody's telling you, you know what you tell them? Bullshit. BS. I don't buy it. I prefer that you come clean or that you fess up. Esto es confesar. Or also to be straight up with me. Franco, sincero. And we'll wrap up the episode talking about if this is still relevant today. I think I've highlighted it in many cases on social media, with memes. I think we are constantly under psychological warfare. That's why you have to be careful what you let into your mind. But some recent examples of propaganda. The ghost of Kiev. Remember that? When the Ukrainian war started. It was fake. It was phony. It never happened. And you have Twitter memes like that all the time. Twitter's constantly killing people or starting wars. Do you know how many times I've seen World War III trending? And I think propaganda is alive and well. This is why I don't subscribe to any mainstream media. I don't want to watch CNN or Fox. I want just the facts. And that's what we give you here on FYI. I really hope you enjoyed this week's episodes, and I hope you'll join us on next week's episodes of FYI.